Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a seguir con el de ¿por qué nos resistimos a Dios? Aquí tenemos a Miller, pero también al otro lado está Claudia. ¿Qué tal? Desde Argentina.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, buenas tardes aquí en Argentina.
Aquí tenéis el canal de Claudia. Este es el último de los vivos que hace en Facebook y lo ha pasado aquí al canal en YouTube que se llama Paradoja Aprendizaje Vivo. Y aquí tenéis algunas vivencias, ¿verdad? Bueno, luego hablamos si acaso más de estas cosas. Vamos a ver esta continuación de ¿por qué nos resistimos a Dios? De Miller. Y bueno, pues allá vamos, ¿no? Si hay una cosa ya me interrumpes, a ver si se escucha bien. Y si se escucha bien, no me dices nada y seguimos.
So I don't know if you think about your childhood with regard to going to school. You know how you were sent off to school usually by mum and dad. You're 5 years old, and they start teaching you the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s if you haven't already learned them, right? Now, if you look at what they're doing, teaching you those particular things, they're teaching you what you call to be the foundation of language and the foundation of mathematics, the foundation of learning. Now, as a child, you didn't go, oh, I don't want to learn that. Because for most children, they are far more open than that, aren't they? They just say, oh, okay, that's what they want to teach me, so I'll learn that, and I'll ask questions about it, and before you know it, the child's engaged in the process of learning. And the child engages this process of learning automatically without resistance, without any real belief systems associated with it at that point in time. Can you see that? Now, if we revert to that kind of learning with regard to God, we would be far better off than trusting what the world tells us about God. But what we do is we wait for everybody else to tell us about God because we don't connect to God personally. We have to connect to other people who say they're connected to God. And as a result of that, we trust what they say about God. So this is what happens from a perspective of religion. Instead of it being, somebody learning the basics and then discovering more complicated things through the process of learning, just like we learnt mathematics and just like we learnt language, the problem with religion is that it's all told to us without us going through a process of learning. In other words, they tell us the belief systems. Even from a very young age, you think of when you were going, did any of you go to Sunday school? A few? Yeah. What did you find? You were being told, you didn't have the process of discovery, you had the process of just being told, this is how God is, this is what happened. And it was all a certainty. Right? There was no gradual learning involved in the process where you learnt the basics of discovery, how to discover. See, when you were taught mathematics, you were taught numbers first, and then you were taught how to manipulate numbers and how to add them and subtract them and multiply them and divide them. And then you went on to more complex things with regard to mathematics. That's how you learned mathematics. And for some of us, we got add, plus, minus, multiply, divide, and that's about as far as we went. And for others, because we were fascinated in the subject, we went right the way through into algebraic equations and right the way into calculus and right the way into scientific and mathematical equations and right into the depths of mathematics as a result of this process of learning how to learn about it. But none of us have been taught how to learn about God, if you think about it. We've just been told what God is. We haven't been told how to learn about God. And what we need to do if we're going to develop any faith, is what we need to do is first start with the base of, well, everything we're told may be wrong. Everything that we've been told may be wrong. because it was just people telling us. We never went through any process of discovery of this. It was just somebody telling me information that I then accepted. And I felt a very strong emotional reason to accept it, because whenever I didn't accept it, the minister or priest or mother or father who wanted to tell me it often got angry with me. And so, of course, you know, that was a great motivation to accept it. Right? And so we must accept that, firstly, everything that we've been told may be wrong about God. Secondly, that it's possible, given that people...
Aunque no quiero interrumpir nada, pero bueno, quiero comentar que también con la manera en que se nos dan las matemáticas y las diferentes disciplinas, también hay una especie de cerrar también a veces, o sesgar hacia un lado y no hacia otro, de eso, de las disciplinas. No sé si quieres comentar algo aquí. Yo es que esto sí que simplemente lo quiero comentar porque hice algunos vídeos hace poco sobre el tema y no voy a hacer más en el canal principal de ellos. Si acaso hago más, voy a hacer uno en un secundario, que has visto que es muy fácil abrirse un canal secundario en YouTube. Entonces, el tema es que el número es relación a la vez. Y eso, al nivel de las matemáticas también hay un poco de problemas ahí, que las asociamos muy rápidamente a números y ahí hay ya se nos está dando un sesgo. Entonces, claro, el sesgo para con Dios ya no es ni siquiera un sesgo, sino que es directamente decirte, o sea, no puedes descubrir por ti misma, pero bueno, en las matemáticas también hay como que te encarrilan por un lado. Y es lo que quería comentar. ¿Quieres comentar algo al respecto? Porque tú eres profa de niños.
Claro. Sí, si bien hay como una secuencia que implica de alguna forma un proceso, y participar en ese proceso,
Se te oye poco.
Sigue siendo algo acabado. Sigue siendo algo ya predeterminado, precocido sería.
Claro,
Y
no se dispone para que aprendan por su cuenta, tampoco
no hay. En el enfoque, por ejemplo, hay en el procedimiento, hay rigurosidades que son requisitos. Y me pasaba, por ejemplo, con niños que podían hacer mentalmente el cálculo y que tenían mecanismos propios de combinación de cifras, que primero lo hacían a nivel intelectual, que ya tenían la dificultad de dibujarlo. Y era requisito, no, pero ¿de dónde sacaste el número? Y como la desconfianza, digamos, y por ahí está basado que había que, bueno, el niño se veía forzado a utilizar. Y después que está el procedimiento convencional. Entonces hacía un mecanismo que no encajaba en lo convencional, ya quedaba descalificado. Es así. Claro, está el protocolo y no, pero no hiciste de esta forma. Y lamentablemente vamos, sí, como decís vos, mutilando las oportunidades propias, digamos, particulares.
A ver si lo vamos a comentando mucho más y no quiero interrumpir ya más este vídeo, claro. pero es que este es un poco el tema de mi vida, por así decirlo, dentro de, o sea, no es que sea el único tema, pero quiero decir, aparte de que no he hecho, o sea, queda todo por hacer al respecto, pero es un poco mi frustración porque en realidad el número, si te das cuenta, es formas de reunir, maneras de reunir. Entonces, en realidad, la manera de reunir las cosas, que es la forma en realidad, está a la vez que la materia reunida. Son cosas que se dan juntas. Entonces, a eso un alma, las almas son muy poderosas, aunque sean muy pequeñas, ante la sensibilidad acerca de las relaciones. Pero el mundo, relación a la vez. Entonces, las almas de los niños pueden recibir, como estamos viendo, cada vez mejor estamos sintiendo que es cierto, ¿verdad? Lo que nos dice Miller, que podemos recibir verdad directa a través de la conciencia, el órgano en el alma, para recibir eso, verdad directa de Dios, Entonces, ostras, y además sabemos que eso sí, incluso Miller lo comenta a veces, ¿no? Que hay un sentido de que es verdad la frase típica que también se dice en la nueva era, todo está relacionado, pero se usa de muchas maneras que luego ya sabemos, puede ser equivocas o como se diga. Entonces, todo está relacionado y las almas, o sea, y entonces eso, los sesgos, y me da un poco de rabia eso aquí, que asociemos muy rápidamente eso, matemáticas con... Bueno, pero ya lo hablaremos más.
Bueno.
Pero se ha entendido, ¿no? Lo que queríamos.
Sí, sí, sí. Bueno, en realidad que venimos compartiendo, hay antecedentes, digo, venimos compartiendo material de la verdad divina y es intrínseco, o sea, no está disociado para nada, al contrario.
Sí.
Entonces, es matemática perfecta, sí. Que sí, uno comprende.
Nuestra civilización está muy sesgada enseguida al tema del número, precios. Está todo mezclado ahí, que es muy divertido pensarlo y comentarlo, que aún no hemos hecho una conversación sobre eso juntos, pero incluso con más gente que suele participar, ¿verdad? Que a lo mejor sí que íbamos a hacerla. Bueno, que sigamos, que si no, y perdonad que ya no interrumpimos más, si veis esto. Espero que ya, a no ser que tú quieras algo ya gordísimo o que tengas que ir al servicio o lo que sea. Venga, vamos para allá.
People on earth are loving or have the capacity at least to love. That this love must have come from somewhere. That would make a logical sense, wouldn't it? If I, inside of myself, have the capacity to love, have the capacity to tell the truth, have the capacity for wisdom, have the capacity to understand, or in other words, to absorb knowledge, then it would make sense that any person who has said to have created me, assuming that such a person exists, would also have the same capacities to a greater degree. Would not that make sense? Yes. So from a logical perspective, it would make sense that if God exists, then God would have a larger capacity for love than I do, that God would have a larger capacity for truth than I do, that God would have a larger capacity for wisdom, power, knowledge, and any other thing that I can think of that exists as a quality inside of myself. God must have a larger capacity than I do for any of those qualities.
En realidad dice mayor poder también y mayor conocimiento. Aquí esto no estaría bien en lo que al final he dejado como traducción. En fin, mayor poder, mayor conocimiento, sigamos.
And if that's the case, then I can start having this idea or faith, if you like. That perhaps, if there is a God, perhaps this God is more loving, more truthful, more wise, more powerful, more knowledgeable than I am. Now, if we look at the issue of God being more loving than I am, for example, I don't want to punish my children forever when my children do something wrong. How many of you have had children? Have you wanted to punish your children forever when they did something wrong? None of you. And yet the religions tell you that if a person dies having done things wrong that they're not sorry for, that God is going to punish them forever. Now, to me, I can now have some faith that if I have, through this logical discussion of knowledge, I can have some faith that if I would never punish my child
Algo de fe en que
forever, surely God, who would have to have more love, more knowledge, more wisdom, more power, more understanding, more truth than I do, surely God wouldn't do it. That's a pretty valid assumption, isn't it? If that God exists, he wouldn't do it. So I can only get down to the point.
sí que quede claro aquí, que estaba un poco mal, algo de fe. Puedo tener algo de fe en que eso, si yo no lo hago, pues Dios, que es más que yo en estos sentidos, tampoco lo va a hacer.
Point was, does he exist or doesn't he exist at the end of that? Because if God exists, he or she does have more love, more truth, more knowledge, more power, more wisdom, and more every other quality that I have than I have. That's the reality. So now it really gets down to firstly determining whether God exists or not. And how do you know whether something exists that you can't see? All of you accept that wind exists, yes? You can't see it, but what do you see? So
you can actually see the effect of it.
You see the effects of it. What else?
You can feel it.
You can feel it. So you see the effects of it and you feel it. So how do you measure things you can't see? There's only two real ways. Can you see that? There's only two real ways. Ways of measuring something you can't see. You either have to feel it or see the effects of it. They're the only two ways. So the same applies with God. Can you see that? The only way that we're going to ever develop a relationship with God properly is that we're going to have to either do one or both of those two things, because we can't see God. So we have to either feel God or see the effects of God. We have to do one of those two things. Now, in terms of developing faith, how do we do that? So let's look at the first thing, seeing the effects of God. Now, I believe seeing the effects of God, or let's call it seeing God's creations, like when the wind blows, it creates all sorts of things, doesn't it? It creates the trees swaying. You feel this pressure on your face, right? You see the leaves blowing, like flowing through the wind. And if you put some smoke in the air, you'll see the smoke flowing in the direction of the wind. There's all these effects that the wind has, yes, on the process. So if we apply the same thing to another thing that we can't see, and that is God, then it would make sense that if we examine God's creation, we might see some effects of God. Something that we can see God must exist in. Does that make sense? And then secondly, as we pointed out earlier, what was the second? There was seeing and then feeling. Now, I feel that's much more difficult to feel God, because to feel God, I've got all these problems with God. And to feel God, and if God's none of these things, feeling God is going to be pretty difficult. Can you see that? So feeling God initially is going to be much more difficult than seeing God through creation. Now, if you examine, for most of you who believe in God, you've already examined creation to a fair degree, haven't you? And you look at the complexity of creation, you go, wow, there's a lot of intelligence in creation, is there not? And we start examining the intelligence, and to be frank, most of humanity have no idea of the amount of intelligence in creation. Like, do you know that your entire body is designed around a series of numbers, for example? Are you aware of that? Most people are not aware of that, their entire body. And it's usually only when we're taught art that we start to see the relationship between the numbers and how our body is designed. Can I describe that? Okay, let's do that, because this is a part of seeing God's creation and then making some valid assumptions based on what we see. And
Suposiciones válidas, añade la palabra.
many of you counted the number of rows in a pineapple or a pine cone that goes around in one direction and then it goes around in another.
Aquí tenemos un problema que, como estás en Argentina, nos puedes decir si las piñas se llaman igual.
Sí, ananá, se usa más, ananá,
Pero entendéis.
pero se conoce como piña también, sí.
¿Y pinos, los árboles?
Sí, también, sí.
Claro, porque allí además, cuanto más a la montaña vayas, en Argentina, incluso al sur, pues hay muchos tipos de pinos también, ¿no?
Sí.
Vale. Bueno, ya que he parado para el tema este, ahora fíjate que esto va a ser precisamente una aplicación de aquello que veíamos sobre la economía y la función como principios que están inyectados en todas las leyes. Entonces, es como los efectos de que esos principios de economía y función estén inyectados en las leyes amorosas de Dios, los efectos al final se terminan viendo en lo que va a haber aquí numéricamente, por ejemplo, los frutos, pero también en el cuerpo. ¿Por qué? Porque ahora lo va a explicar, pues simplemente de muy de pasada de refilón lo va a comentar. Sigo, pues.
Dale. Tengo curiosidad.
Have you ever done that? It's very interesting. If you drew if you look at a pine cone from its stem down, it's sort of circular in nature, isn't it? And there's the middle of the stem. You'll find that there's these rotational things that go around one direction, and in one direction, there's 8 of them. And then if you follow the rotational directions around in the other direction, you'll find there is always 13 of them. That's what you'll find. And if you count a pineapple, there'll be 13 in one direction and 21 in the other direction. And that's usually always the case.
Sorry, AJ. Well, one was a pine cone and one was a pineapple.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Aquí ella solo ha interrumpido para asegurarse de lo que ha dicho. En la transcripción está bien, pues eso, que primero ha hablado de la piña, pine cone, y luego pineapple, es la piña fruta.
Now, if we get all of those things and we interpolate them into a numbering system, you'll find there's a number system that goes like this, where you get the previous number, you start with 0 and you add 1 to it, and then you add the previous 2 numbers together. So the next number in the sequence is 1, and then 1 and 1 is 2, 1 and 2 is 3, 2 and 3 is 5, 5 and 3 is 8, 5 and 8 is 13. 13 and 8 is 21. 21 and 13 is 34. 21 and 34 is? And the number just keeps on going up, going up, going up, going up ad infinitum, right? Now, a very, very interesting thing happens, and that is this.
Y tenemos estos números involucrados en lo que ha dicho.
If you get one of the numbers that are higher up, like 55, and divide it by 34, you'll find there's always, the higher the number gets, it always approximates this number, 1.618. And that number has some interesting characteristics in that if you invert it, in other words, you go 1 divided by 1.618,
Ahí no ha dicho lo que es la proporción áurea, aunque sí lo pone bajo el pie de foto en la transcripción, pero él no ha dicho ahí exactamente esas palabras, aún no lo ha puesto en nombre, vamos.
You'll find that that will be equal to 0.618. And a pineapple and a pine cone fits within that relationship of its fronds. And in fact, most plants that grow every leaf in a rotation of 0.618 from the previous leaf. And there's a reason why they do that. It's because it has the highest, it's the number with the highest packing density. So in other words, you'll fit the most seeds and the most leaves in a packing density where they all receive light at that rotation. At that rotational angle. Now, how does that relate to your body? Well, these two numbers, 0.618 and 1.618, are very interesting, right? Because that defines the relationship of every joint in your entire body. Now, I'll draw a very basic person here, but I have to draw them with their joints. Right, and we make his arms, we'll do the same with his arms. His hands. His hands aren't proportionate. Now, most people who learn about art and drawing the human figure in art learn this as a basic part of their art course. And the reason why is that every single one of our bodies, yours and mine, are built to the same relationship. And this is how...
La razón por la que la aprenden es que, aquí esto también está mal, cada uno de nuestros cuerpos está construido bla bla.
That is, if you take the height of the person, right, as one, in terms of a relationship, then where their belly button will be 0.618 as a multiple of that. So if you're, let's say you're 157 centimetres, if you multiply that by 0.618, that will be the height of your belly button. If you take every joint from, like, the hip joint and your leg, from your length of your leg, right, then 0.618 will be where your knee is. If you take your knee to the end of your toes, 0.618, it happens to be where your ankle joint is. The same applies to your arm, from your shoulder to there, 0.618 is your elbow, and from there to there, 0.618 is your wrist. If you take your face and measure its length, the top of your the bottom of your nose is 0.618 from the top of your head, and the top of your nose is 0.618 from the bottom of your chin. You know what? And they've known this for thousands of years, yes? Because when they teach you drawing classes of the human body in art school, they teach you this. Yeah? Does that make sense? Now, the question then becomes, that's a fair bit of mathematical design, is it not? That's pretty consistent across every human form. That also seems to be consistent in things like a pineapple, a pine cone, and in fact in the way that the rotational way in which plant leaves are created. If you look at a sunflower head, it has the same rotational figures, but with higher numbers. All of those things are all related. Now, hang on a sec, like if all things came into existence through some kind of spontaneous process, then surely it would all be random, wouldn't it? But it's not. It's not random. It's all got a certain type of a design. So the question has to be asked, well, does design come about without a designer? When you designed your house, or when you look at a house that somebody else has designed, you go, wow, that just spontaneously came into existence without anybody putting it together, without anybody maintaining it. You don't, do you? And yet something far more complicated, your own body, which most of us don't even understand the basics of. Like I would classify this as one of the basic things about your human body. That's one of the least mathematical things that happen in your human body. And the average person on this planet knows nothing about it. Right? But to me, it is evidence of seeing something that God has created. Because to do that requires design. And whenever you have design, there has to be a designer. That makes sense, doesn't it? Logically? Okay, so I see that as something to do with God. Like the fact that design exists means that there has to be some kind of designer. And the fact that this design exists in many living things is an indication that there has to be a designer that created all those living things. A very similar designer, the same designer probably, yes? If you saw a house that looked the same and you saw 25 of them in a row, you'd probably assume that the same person built them, would you not? Well, there's 6.5 or so billion people on this planet, all with the same design. Like my presumption is the same person built that design. Yeah?
It's quite funny when you think about it, because if it wasn't by design and it was just random, what would the human race look like?
Yeah, imagine. And this is where the whole concept of alien species comes about, right? And if you look at shows like, what was it, you know, the Star Wars shows, you know, how they've got all of these strange characters. And the reason why they look so strange to us is because they're all out of harmony with design, with this design. That's why they look strange. And so we need to understand that these designs are all a part of what we see on this planet. They're all very, very similar designs. Now, to me, that's a part of seeing the effects of God's wind blowing. Yes? It's the same, that's how I see it. The effects of the breeze that is God, God's creation. So it helps me see what God has done and therefore believe that potentially God must exist, because I can see there is all this design in what God has done. And this is just one, like this is a very minor thing. And even though it's minor, shells have the same rotational angles, plants have the same rotational angles, we have the same rotational angles. Even the way the hairs appear on our head are in the same rotational angles. In addition to that, the universe in galaxies have the same rotational angles as well. So it goes from what appears to be some of the smallest things in creation right the way through to immensely large things all have these same rotational angles and same mathematical relationships. Now that tells me that, right, okay, if you just saw it in one thing, you'd go, oh, that's pretty amazing. But if you saw it in 2 or 3 things, you start going, well, obviously the same kind of person made those things, right? Or the same being made those things. But if you're starting to see it from everything down to a universal structure, like a galaxy, down to, you know, what we see in like plant-based materials, and even into smaller structures than that, then I'd be starting to go, you know, I'm starting to go, wow, that's a pretty big effect, right? Of the wind of God that blows. Someone that I can't see. Now, I've only brought up one thing because there's literally, like, as you can imagine, there's literally millions of mathematical things of far more complex nature than that we could discuss that all prove God, you know, God's existence. To
me, I think all the problems that were listed with God, like the wrathful God, all these belief systems, if the veil was lifted for afterlife, the spirit world, we would see that we can't really kill each other. We would see that God's laws are in operation for people that did unloving things on earth.
Yep.
We would see that we not come from a monkey or a fish because there's a spirit side to us that most scientists don't look at.
Yes.
So the question is, why such a heavy veil still exists for the afterlife?
The heavy veil only exists because of all of the emotions that we listed. You see, what happens is that when we do not want to face that we hold on to certain emotions, we finish up living in the emotions rather than releasing them. When we live in the emotions, our mind is completely blocked to an alternative viewpoint. So it's a bit like, if you believe that somebody is not a nice person and you never release that emotion, you will carry that belief to your grave, will you not? They might even do philanthropic things and they might do lovely things, but you'll always say, yeah, but I just can't trust them because there's an emotion in you that prevents the trust. And it's exactly the same with us, with everything that we look at. The only reason why we are not open to new thought or new ideas is because we have an emotional thing preventing us from being open to it. And it's the emotion we need to address or deal with if we are truly going to learn. If we are closed in any way emotionally, we are going to be closed to whole areas of investigation. For example, how many of you feel closed to mathematics? Like, where you don't really like their mathematics much, right? Okay. Well, you would never have seen that in your entire life if I hadn't have shown it to you then. Because that's only in books about mathematics and natural mathematics. So you would have looked at mathematics and gone, you know, like, would you? Well, I don't want to read that. I want to read something more interesting than that. And you would never have found it out, right? And the reason why is because there was just this emotional blockage to mathematics that would cause you to never even investigate it. Yeah? And this is the problem with all of our problems with God, is that we are blocked in so many different areas. And as a result of these emotional blockages, we don't allow the concepts to be changed. Now, when we die and we pass over into the spirit world, there's one concept that immediately changes. And that is that you're still alive and you're not dead forever. So that concept's gone. And that then often challenges people who have passed into challenging other concepts. Sometimes it doesn't, unfortunately, but many times it does. And so they start challenging the other concepts of things they've learned here on Earth. And to do that, they have to challenge their emotions, because their emotions are going to determine their belief structure. Their emotions are going to determine what goes on. So it's always our emotions that prevent us from investigating with an open heart. So this is why I'm saying to you that emotional work is a very, very important part of your relationship with God. Not because in the end it's going to be an important part, but because it prevents relationship and it prevents knowledge. It prevents you from absorbing knowledge when you're not released. When you have not released emotions that prevent the knowledge from being absorbed. So I can have that discussion with a person who's very resistive to God, and I'll say all of that to them, and they'll say, yep.
Aquí tampoco ha dicho lo de, no ha puesto el nombre de proporción áurea.
But that's no proof that God exists. And I'm saying, And so, and I'm saying, so, okay, I see some inconsistencies here. You know, if I took you down for a drive down this road here and showed you every house driving down this road and told you nobody built it, would you accept me saying that to you? And they immediately say, of course not, somebody built it. And I said, okay, somebody built that, which is not very complicated, let's face it. It's like a few beams here and a few blocks here and there, a bit of substances here and there. Compared to my body, it's nothing really in terms of complexity. And yet you're telling me that my body, which is the same design as your body and your body and your body, we all have the same design, and there's millions of them, billions of them. In fact, on the planet, you're telling me that all of those can't have got here, had to have got here by chance, when the house that I'm looking at down the road there, I told you come by chance and you can't accept that. Right? So to me, there's no logic there, right? Once the person starts going down that track. But the reason why there's no logic is because they are totally blocked to the emotional concept of God. That's why there's no logic. Do you follow me? If I refuse to accept there is a God, it's going to block me to a lot of logic. It's going to block me. And this is I gave a talk recently in Melbourne. It was called Logic, Emotions and Truth. And in that talk, I talked about how to determine truth with logic and emotions being used together. And I suggest that anybody who is struggling with determining truth needs to have a listen to that presentation. But if you look at our examination of God, I find that is when we are the most illogical of all. And there's a great reason for why we are the most illogical when we look at God, and it's because we have the most emotional issues with God. And anything that we have an emotional issue about, we're going to have the least amount of logic with. That's the unfortunate truth. So now that we at least can establish, and we could go on forever looking at God's creations, I feel. In fact, the way I feel God's design creation is proof of existence. A-N-C, E-N-C, E-N-C. Right? God has designed creation in the way that God has to prove to us that God exists. That's the whole point of the way in which it's been designed. Right? And to me, that then says, okay, God is definitely intelligent. It takes a pretty intelligent being to come up with mathematical formula and then apply it to like literally thousands of different sort of creations throughout the universe in different scales. It's a pretty intelligent being. With a lot of power, of course, too, right? But a very intelligent being. Now, if God's intelligent and me, using my limited intelligence, goes, yes, and it's not intelligent to fight people, is it? Do you find that? It's intelligent to fight people. Like you bop somebody in the nose, and what generally happens? They bop you back, and then what do you do if you still want to engage? You bop them back, and what in the end happens? If you're not given a gun, you'll beat each other into a pulp and be so exhausted that you can't even hit each other another time and be hospitalised. And what resulted from the whole thing? Nothing. Now that's not very intelligent. And I go, well, God's obviously far more intelligent than I am, and I can see that people fighting with each other is not very intelligent. Right? So I would then feel that means that God feels people fighting each other isn't intelligent either. God would have more intelligence than I have about that issue. This is without even looking at the issue of love, whether it's loving to fight each other or not. Just is it an intelligent action? No, it's not. It's not something that's clever or logical. So I find through this examination that there are certain qualities immediately through this proof of existence that God has given me of God's existence. There are certain qualities that I can straight away see present in this proof. And the qualities are, one of them is intelligence. I see also a lot of qualities related to love, because I see there's a focus, even in our human bodies, on receiving and giving pleasure. And there's our power of this to that.
Aquí se ve la luz.
Must be just the lights. So, it'll be the light one, but please don't turn off the...
Se ve la luz para demostrar que los humanos somos muy tontos, ¿no? No hice eso, pero por comentar mientras.
Yeah, because we've got it running from the power.
No sé cuántos ratos estaba, no sé si pasarlo, creo que es poco. Ya.
God said, let there be light in the light.
Y aquí había bromeado, he dicho, Dios dijo que permitirá que se haga la luz o algo así. Que se haga la luz.
Interesting thing does that happen when I'm discussing certain matters. And so,
interesante la cuestión que sucede cuando hablamos de ciertas cuestiones, dicho aquí. Ha dicho antes.
I see the evidence of love in a lot of the creation, right? The evidence of love is present everywhere. I see the evidence of wisdom. I see a lot of what are called symbiotic relationships. You see them too, yes, in creation, where without a certain thing or thing being created, we could not even exist. For example, if there were no trees producing oxygen, we would not survive. There's a symbiotic relationship. There's also a symbiotic relationship in that they absorb what we breathe out. There's a symbiotic relationship in that. So we breathe out, they breathe in. They breathe out, we breathe in. Very symbiotic. And there's so many of these symbiotic relationships which prove wisdom, which prove relationship between these particular things. And I go, okay, this part of examining God through creation, we see proof of God's existence, and we also see not only proof of existence, but we also see proof of other qualities. Intelligence being one of them, love being another, wisdom being another, and so forth. Now, this then has established to me that I can have some faith that God is like that. Can you see that? Because I've now got some proof of existence and proof that these qualities exist in the things that I'm examining in creation. This then allows me to have some faith that there is obviously some way that I can start to feel God. Now, the whole reason in the first century why I discovered that I could receive divine love was all that entire process that I've just described to you. I went through looking at what I saw around me. I saw intelligence in everything around me. I saw love in everything around me in the sense of how it was created in its pristine state, not how man destroyed it, but how it was in its pristine state. And I saw all this wisdom, and so I then felt very strongly in my heart that God does exist. And then I used a little bit of logic. And the little bit of logic I used, it didn't require very much because I was very young when I did it, was that if God existed and God had intelligence and love and wisdom and those kind of qualities, then it would make sense that there must be some way that I can feel God. and there must be some way that God can feel me. And so I made that presumption that there must be some way, and then for the rest of my life in the first century, I just spent experimenting with finding a way to feel God. Does that make sense? And in that process, I discovered that I could feel God and that God could feel me. And then if I desired to feel God, I could feel a feeling coming from God. And along with those feelings coming from God, which overwhelmed me at the time, I had other things come to me, which is what I discussed with you yesterday, the eternal benefits of this relationship with God. And, so,
la parte más sustancial de esta charla sobre los eternos beneficios es esto que vimos de comunicarse con Dios, que sería vimos toda la segunda parte, las segundas 2 horas, que ya digo es lo más sustancial, esa la completaremos también, si acaso.
I don't want to interrupt until you finish.
Okay. It's already happened. Far away.
So this is just following on from my initial question.
Mm-hmm. Does that satisfactorily answer your original one about faith?
Well, it deepens my experience of this question. Like, it opens me up to more feelings. And my feeling is really, or my question is a lot of, it's hard because I'm having feelings and questions at the same time and maybe answers at the same time. But
dice que es duro porque cree que estás sintiendo las preguntas al mismo tiempo, varias y varias respuestas también al mismo tiempo. Y por cierto, y al principio pues le ha estado comentando que no sabía si interrumpir y Miller creo que ha dicho, bueno, no pasa, ya lo has hecho, no sé qué. Porque es un momento, claro, ha sido un momento de la charla de Miller muy intensas. Y bueno, y ahora vemos que también ella está como muy emocionada así con el tema. Y va a sacar esto ya.
there's some kind of feminine quality. I think it's a feminine quality about emotion, which means that when you appeal to my intellect, I like what you say and it makes sense to me and it has generated faith in me. But there is a dominance, it feels, of emotion inside of me.
Yes.
And this question that I asked is based more on, it's almost like a visceral kind of feeling that I have in entering a new level of faith, one that doesn't rely on my intellect, but that challenges my emotion through its existence, through my actions. There's more that I want to ask you about this, but...
You haven't asked anything yet.
No. I'm sorry. Sometimes I feel I could talk to you about this in private, and other times I feel that many other people must experience this, and so I don't know whether...
Well, can I...
Se ha dicho que algunas veces hemos hablado en privado sobre ello y que piensa que mucha más gente también quiere hablar de esto y no sé qué. Entonces, bueno, ya Miller ya empieza aquí.
Can I discuss the point you're making?
Yeah.
And that is, if you examine number one, this point part here, you can see that this helps us to examine logic, doesn't it?
And I'm aware that I have, that was one of my questions, like I have emotions surrounding logic, and I feel many women do.
Many women
told
do, I agree.
From an early time we are not logical.
Yes.
And we're told that that's a man's domain. And when it comes to connecting with logic emotionally, I think it triggers shame and fear inside of me as well. So is this just part of what I need to process?
Well, no, there are certain, your original question really is based around, are there certain masculine traits associated with certain ways of understanding things? And are there certain feminine traits with the way we understand things? And the answer is yes. There is certain ways that the masculine side of the soul treats information in comparison to the feminine side of the soul. Both ways are important for the soul itself. They are not mutually exclusive. Does that make sense to everyone? So let me discuss what I mean by this. Logic is generally treated, and when I say generally, these are all generalizations that will be made now. Logic is generally treated as, and it is something more attractive to the male. You can see that men generally feel more attracted to logical explanations than women. Does that make sense? And feeling God has to do with emotions, does it not? So you can put emotions in here. And generally, women process truth firstly by feeling about it rather than thinking about it. So that is a very much a female type of dominant thing to do. Yes? Now, if we think about this as the two halves of the soul, so here's our soul, here's the masculine part of it and the feminine part of it. Can you see that each half is essential for the determining of truth? You see that? The logical half is very, very important for the determination of truth, and the emotional part is very important for the determination of truth. When I talk about seeing God's creations and examining God's creations, I am then referring and then making some logical inferences about those particular things that I see. But that is still not feeling God. Right? I also have to be open to this more feminine trait, if you like, which is to be able to sense the truth through emotions. Now, there's only one problem. And that is that generally our emotions on earth are very distorted. They are injured. And for this reason, many people find looking at things emotionally very distorting as well, because the emotions themselves are distorting. Now, if our emotions were completely free of any unlovingness in them and completely free of any like rebellion and other types of feelings that we had, and they were completely open to absorbing new information emotionally, then can you see this would be a very rapid way of learning the truth about things.
Antes ponía crear distorsión, que las emociones crean distorsión, que a lo mejor también se podría decir, pero en realidad ha vuelto a decir que simplemente están distorsionadas, are distorted, creo que es.
But unfortunately, on the planet, the majority of us are very emotionally damaged, and therefore we have emotional injuries, and therefore we can't always just trust the emotion as a way of determining the truth. Can you see that? We have to add together both of the masculine and feminine traits of determining truth to actually determine truth. And if we don't do that, we're going to have a flaw of some kind or other, in that if we look only at logic without feeling at all, we'll eventually end up with some flaws. And if we look at only emotion without looking at anything logical at all, we'll also end up with flaws. And this is what's very important. Now, for a woman, because there is an automatic association with emotion, more so than the male, she will find determining truth through emotion an easier proposition than determining truth through logic. And because the male has a more dominant feeling of wanting logic than emotion, then he will generally struggle with determining things emotionally as truth. And what we need to do is address both sets of emotional injuries, our injuries towards logic and our injuries towards emotion, if we're truly going to examine all truth and therefore understand everything about God. You can see the only two ways we can feel, we can see something that cannot be seen by our eyes. There's only two ways, and it's the same. So when we look at the wind, remember we said right at the beginning of this, if we look at the wind, there's only two ways of seeing that it exists. One is by seeing the results of it, which is to do with logic. The other is by feeling it ourselves, which is to do with emotion, feelings, sensations. Yeah?
Just to add to that before you wrap that off, what I observe in you is that you are able to connect with truth in a logical way, even if it is first intellectually, but that guides that can govern your emotional process. Like you can hold truth while you experience emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And what it feels like to me is that even though I've thought that I've lived a very mind-dominated life, my emotions have governed everything.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I'm so emotional, it scares me, and I'm constantly trying to manage that through my fear.
Mm-hmm.
My growing feeling is that it's an aspect of femininity, or you know how you connect to truth readily and this guides your emotions. I feel that for the feminine aspect, I hate that.
You're going to have to allow the ready connection to emotion.
Yes.
Before you will determine truth.
And it feels like a connection to love will guide my emotional process, whereas a connection to truth has led you to emotion and love.
Yes.
I have to connect to love.
Yes. Emotion is the way.
Yes.
Love is an emotion.
I have
to so logic. If you think of logic very, very definitely surrounds truth, doesn't it? And emotion, if you look at the most dominant emotion you can feel that's the most pleasurable, it's generally always love, right? So you can see again truth and love being needed, right, in any interaction and also in any investigation. Now, for the female, you are going to have to completely open up to emotion before you're going to be able to completely determine truth. For a male, he's going to have to completely open up to logic before he's going to be able to start to determine truth. Does that make sense? Everyone get that? So when a male says to me, we're driving down the road and I say, oh, that house wasn't built by anybody, and that house wasn't built by anybody, and so forth, which is totally illogical. And he says, you're being totally logical now. I go, yes, I am. Right? And then I say, well, your body was built by somebody too. And then now he says, no, that's not true. And I say, now you're being totally illogical. And if he connects to the reason why he's being illogical, he'll actually work through the situation quite well and be able to determine some truth. But that kind of discussion generally won't interest the woman as much. Right? And that's because the way in which she associates truth is through the emotion of love. Right? And both halves of this are a part of the halves of the soul. Remember, our soul is one complete unit expressed in a masculine and feminine form. So we need both halves. The difference for myself, though, with yourself, Darren, is is that I am not blocked to my emotion.
And I see that. I see that you're quite open to both logic and emotion.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I
feel
don't,
like
I don't have a fear or a terror. That's off again. I don't have a fear or terror associated with the emotion. If we just turn on, if you turn them back on, Alex, and then just turn off two of the back ones or something. Like, on the left-hand side, there's 4 switches. Now, if you go across no further, off the box, yeah. On the right-hand side ones are the ones I was going to point you to. If you turn on the left-hand side ones and turn off the right-hand side ones, that'll give us light at the front where we can still use our video, and hopefully it might stop tripping the lights.
Thank you, Darren. And I apologise to everyone else if that wasn't relevant. But
Yeah, no, I think it is a relevant part of the discussion in the sense that God has given us 2 ways to examine everything. And one way is dominantly masculine, and the other way is dominantly feminine.
yeah, and I guess I'm having stronger and stronger feelings about that.
Yeah, and if we can include both methods, if a person of any gender includes both methods, you'll arrive at certainty. And if you examine, it's the same with the wind. If we go back to the wind analogy, and I used to use the wind analogy all the time in the 1st century, and if you go back to that analogy, you can see the effects of the wind. There's the logic. You can feel the effects of the wind. There's the emotion. There's the feelings. And if you examine God in the same way, you'll be able to both see God through logic and see God through feelings. Okay?
No, that's really awesome that you brought that up, Mary, because I've been kind of trying to work this out for a while. And in my relationship with my partner, the same sort of thing happens where I have a tendency to see things as a way of patterns. I look back and through experience, I say, when this happened last time, this was happening.
Yeah.
So there's a pretty likely event that the same thing is happening again.
Yes.
So if we can start from there, and this is the way I talk to her to try and help her.
So you face things through a logical perspective.
Yeah. So and then I guess I try and make her see in that way to.
So you present her with some logic that she can then work her way through.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I feel this. Maybe this is the frustration in me that I don't feel that she can feel that, or she does that same sort of thing.
Yeah.
She approaches it from a totally different point.
She will. She'll be approaching it from this direction.
Yeah.
The other half of the soul is the way that approaches. So this is where each half of the soul can assist the other. So for instance, an example, the feminine half of the soul can assist the male to feel about things when he's trying to think about them all the time. Right? So for example, if you analyse things from a purely loving perspective, you can see a lot of truth automatically. Yeah, and you can see it often a lot more rapidly than you can if you examine it from a logical perspective. Right? The truth is that if you make the presumption that love and truth are associated with each other, you can actually see a lot of truth by actually examining what's loving and what isn't loving. Right? And this is where, but to do that, you have to be open emotionally. You have to be open to feelings and sensations, right? And this is where I feel there's been a dominant shutdown of femininity on the planet. Feelings and sensations and emotions women have been told now for many, many centuries that they're having an emotion and they're having a feeling or a sensation is not very trustworthy. I've been told that it's actually lesser in terms of priority than, well, logic itself. This is why many women are trying to become more logical without and trying to feel less on the planet. The problem with doing that is you will find you're shutting down the ability God's given you to determine truth. Right? So when you're criticised for being emotional, or when you're criticised for being sensitive or feeling things, but usually, oftentimes the criticism comes from a male, yes, and they are not realising at that time that they're actually shutting down the way in which a woman determines truth and the way in which she has a natural ability to determine truth. When a woman criticises a man, man's logic, which I see many women also doing, she is not realising in that moment that she is shutting down him from determining truth through the determination of logic, because that is the way that he is connected to the determination of truth. Right? If instead we learn to embrace the other way rather than criticise it, so the man learns to embrace the feminine way and the female learns to embrace the masculine way, then in the end we'll have even more power to determine truth. But what we have happening on the planet is a separation between the two methods. The masculine condemns the feminine for their emotion, and the feminine condemns the masculine for his logic. That's very counterproductive. Because when you look at how we need to see God, we can see one aspect is very logical and one aspect is very emotional or feeling-based. And to be frank, we need to engage both if we're really going to determine the truth. Can you see that? And so my suggestion is stop condemning the opposite gender for what appears to be their inability to be like you. Right? Because the reality is that we are both able, both sides of the genders are able to use both methods to determine truth and need to. And we need to honour in the other what is not in ourselves rather than condemning in the other what is not in ourselves. Yes? That's what draws you together, actually. Yes? Rather than separating. When the male condemns the female for the lack of logic, and the female condemns the male for his lack of emotion, right, we have separation. When the male loves the female for her emotion, and the female loves the male for his logic, now we have attraction. Yeah? And interestingly, I cannot examine my relationship with God without both. Because God is like the wind. God cannot be seen without seeing the effects or feeling them. So therefore I need both to examine my relationship with God. Make sense?
Could you have, in the same sex couple, two females, for example, one being more logical than the other and the other being more emotional, and that's just the exact same situation?
Definitely, although generally in a same-sex couple, in a same-sex soul, there will be a very much more even distribution of logic and emotion. And so therefore, both sides of the soul, in the case of yours, both females involved in the complete soul, will have a relatively even distribution of emotion and logic in comparison to other women. And the same applies to a male same-gender soul. So when we have a homosexual men couple, there will be a more even distribution of emotion and logic in that couple generally as well.
So the fact that it sometimes looks, say with a male to male, one is more feminine.
One will always be probably more feminine, and one will be more masculine.
In the female, one might look really masculine.
Yeah.
But then some of those extremes of difference are, my understanding is that's the damage that has
Yes.
come from how society's treated us.
Exactly.
Aquí entiendo, pues eso, cuando las diferencias son muy extremas, a veces eso resulta del daño desde muy tempranamente, ¿no? Como se trata en la sociedad.
Yeah. So what I'm saying applies to any soul, whether they're homosexual in nature or heterosexual in nature, which are all just really souls in nature, right? And we just put the labels of homosexuality and heterosexuality upon them. The reality is any soul, which includes you with your other half, includes myself with my other half, any soul has the ability to determine truth through these two ways. And they're the only two ways available to determine truth that is invisible to us. You know, there are certain truths that are visible to us, which we can use our sight, touch, taste, and all other types of sensations to determine truth with. But to determine the truth of something that's invisible to us, we only really have two methods. Does that make sense? Available to us. And these two methods are inbuilt inside of each part of the soul. These two methods are inbuilt. But to embrace them, we've got to embrace them. If we're going to embrace logic, then embrace logic completely. Don't be illogical with some things and illogical with others. And if you're going to embrace emotion, be completely emotional. Don't just try to shut it down constantly and push it away constantly and all those kind of things. Embrace the emotion. Many of you ladies are not allowed, or you feel you're not allowed to embrace your emotion. And if you think about relationships you've had in the past or relationships you're in, you can see how often you're not allowing even your own embracing of emotion at times, when you feel very emotional and then you feel a bit self-conscious because the guy sitting next to you watching telly and you're having a cry and he's just looking at it and you go, well, what's going on there? And you feel self-conscious and those kind of, these are all emotions that we need to address. We need to come to accept. In between the genders, that these both methods are essentially part of the way in which we have available to determine truth that is not visible to us. And we need to use both methods if we're ever going to be successful in determining the truth about God. And perhaps that's the time to just have a break, I think. We'll have a break for an hour, shall we? And just have some lunch and so forth. And then I'm happy to answer any questions about the subject or other subjects after the break.
Bueno, pues hasta aquí. ¿Qué tal? ¿Estamos vivos?
Siempre tan profundo a la vez.
Sí, al principio la primera palabra que me pones a oído.
Tan simple como siempre y tan profundo a la vez. Digo,
Sí.
en un momento me sentí muy emocionada. Recuerdo algunas actitudes de mi hijo Juan Ignacio, por ejemplo, cuando empezó a leer y él empezaba a unir las letras, los sonidos, que es, bueno, el dibujo, el símbolo, digamos, grafema y tema, o sea, lograba pronunciar, y cuando empezaba a ver cómo se formaba la palabra, él empezaba a reírse y terminaba llorando. Terminaba llorando de alegría.
O sea, ¿cómo es la situación? ¿Lo puedes narrar otra vez? O sea, tú estabas en
Él empezaba a leer, Juan Ignacio empezaba a leer, yo pude atestiguar ese proceso, él empezaba a leer, pero yo no era su maestra, entonces era paralelo, digamos, podía hacerlo como en un ambiente más no escolarizado de la casa y conocer el proceso el trasfondo o el marco en el que sucede, ¿no? Entonces, él empezaba a unir las letras, digamos, porque es letra, después sílaba y palabra. Entonces empezaba a pronunciarlas y en esa unión que pronunciás y empezás a hacer un poco más fluido, al aparecer la palabra, Juan Ignacio se reía y empezaba a reírse y era muy contradictorio, parecía. Tu risa estaba en un llanto. ¿Y cómo nos cuesta? Digo yo, pensé en un momento esto que él cuenta, porque ahí me emocioné, como no estábamos hablando, digamos, me recordó cuando él describe las proporciones del cuerpo y cuando lleva a esa, y realmente me hizo recordar eso, ¿no? Yo no sabía, no sabía la secuencia de, ¿cómo es? Fibonacci, parece que es.
Sí, pero fíjate que no da el nombre en ningún momento él, luego lo pone en la traducción y por eso en la traducción está, que ahí se puede.
Aparece, claro.
Sí, de hecho aparece las figuras, pero esto del tema de, o sea, sería un gozo, lloraba de alegría, como sintiendo
claro.
Es un alma creadora.
Era para él emocionante y ahora Juan Ignacio tiene 24 años. Y me cuenta, por ejemplo, está trabajando y me cuenta que cuando él que está teniendo, digamos, momentos de ese tipo de sensación, esa alegría en la que se está permitiendo, incluso supongo que por ley de atracción, obviamente, está donde está y todo eso tiene sentido, pero en lo que se permite sentir de recordar, o sea, de eso, y asociaba a esa experiencia ya ahora adulto, de hacer algo que quizás para alguien ha perdido totalmente, ¿no? Conozco, por ejemplo, ingeniero alemán que vive en Alemania. Tuve acá la oportunidad de conocerlo en Argentina. Él no cree en Dios, o sea, pero digo yo, saber lo de las medidas, reconocer, o sea, poder ponerse en ese lugar de ingeniero, o sea, diseñar, crear, y aún así negar, o sea, hasta dónde está anestesiado. Y quizás ni siquiera es un creador, porque es, digamos, hace cosas, entre comillas, no nuevas, por decir, entre comillas.
Claro, todo eso está ahí muy automatizado, pero ¿por qué pones el ejemplo de este ingeniero?
Porque digo yo, como ya está anestesiado él, no se puede maravillar, o sea, bueno, aparte de que ya el año que tiene,
claro,
llega incluso al punto de vista de que ni siquiera de sus propias creaciones, ¿no? Nada, o sea, eso es
todo lo contrario a lo que sería la demostración de Juan Ignacio de pequeño, ¿no? Que sería lo natural.
Claro, eso, yo veía como él, quizás bien un soldador, porque me dijo, mamá, he logrado soldar un chasis, me dijo, estaba ocioso, o sea, había terminado la parte electrónica, que es la que él hace, se fue a jugar, entre comillas, con algo que no sabía hacer. Dice, estoy muy contento, he logrado hacer tal cosa, incluso me contó que se golpeó la cabeza fuerte también, por ley de atracción algo habrá tenido que ver, pero él quedó, me dice, no sabes qué hermoso fue para mí poder ver eso terminado y haberlo hecho. Me dijo, haberlo hecho desde el no saber y haberlo a través. Y quizás alguien con solvencia venga y diga, bueno, una pavada. O, bueno, yo lo hago en 2 patadas. No sé, viste, esas cosas que adultos sobre todo, y nos perdemos ya en la emoción de descubrir eso y de sentir, compartir esa emoción.
De hecho, es tan grave lo que hay que de hecho estamos orgullosos y se premia y está normalizado y buscado y pagado, hay el orgullo de separar, de hecho, lo que acaba de comentar Miller, que es la emoción de la lógica, es decir, es que de hecho hay promociones de eso, están pagadas incluso para que contra todos los discursos alternativos sobre medicina, etcétera, y los ingenieros y pues muchos físicos, pues precisamente no, todo el tema de no entrar en la capa del cuerpo espiritual y del alma tiene que ver con eso, que de hecho está muy bien pagado en todos los niveles el orgullo de haber separado y de haber hecho esta férrea separación que acaba de relatar Miller, sí.
Claro, sí, se promueve, se reconoce, se la llama profesionalismo. Sí,
¿No?
realmente
Y además, como lo que ha dicho Miller es muy importante, porque como las emociones están muy distorsionadas en la Tierra, también es un proceso que es como lógico de que ocurra, porque para poder lograr cosas efectivamente, profesionalmente, como tú acabas de decir, pues claro, como todos estamos tan machacados, no se entiende bien, no sé qué, pues hay que apagar completamente lo emocional y así hemos llegado donde hemos llegado. ¿Vale? En vez de sanar las emociones, lo apagas y consigues, pues es una inteligencia artificial que ahora, pues, estamos prácticamente entregando el alma a ella.
sí, sí. Y decía que esa admiración y sí, básicamente es emoción más que en sí una acción, digamos, es emoción. Como decías al principio un poco, la escuela tiene mucho que ver con esa lógica que va, y lamentablemente, a pesar de que incluso se habla de emoción, porque hemos pillado un poco esa faceta, pero también se habla de gestión emocional o de regulación, o sea, claro, se valida un poco claro, básicamente el control de las emociones, el éxito en función de qué manera lo podés dosificar, administrar entonces, entre comillas, han introducido en algunas opciones, pero se sigue considerando como que lo mejor a quien no las expresa naturalmente, sino que las dosifica o
Sí, o sea, bueno, el enfoque está puesto entonces no en el dejar fluir infantil,
exactamente,
o como el
en no dejarse llevar, sí.
Sí. Claro, porque desde el principio, como pasa en cualquier discurso, menos en la enseñanza de Jesús, que por eso es única, ¿no? Pues, de alguna manera, y tan simple, ¿verdad?, que la teníamos delante de las narices, por así decir, pues que en realidad el manchurrón del alma, el pecado, pues es por lo que hay que empezar, o sea, es que es por eso que sucede todo, y es por nuestro alejamiento desde hace milenios con los dos primeros padres, lo que ha contado en este taller. Entonces, claro, cuando no está ya base del error, cuando duele tanto que no podemos hablar, entonces ya todo queda difuminado, ¿no? Bueno, sí, entonces claro, el que viene se mete ahí de una forma confusa lo que acabas de decir, ¿no? El control, que lo hemos hablado en alguna conversación, es el control de las emociones, no sé qué, vale.
Sí, en realidad no hay una conexión y ni siquiera en este momento, hablando ya en el dual, el dejarse abrumar un poco, que lo describe Mary en su proceso.
¿Qué? Es que sea...
El dejarse abrumar, digamos, en lo espiritual, por ejemplo, y haciendo ya el enfoque desde la nueva era, el dejarse abrumar que no aparece, digamos que, bueno, de por sí hay una negación de Dios y se lo cambia por términos como verso, inteligencia, Tao, y esa como no personalidad, digamos, indefinición, básicamente, pero al mismo tiempo sigue siendo una falacia en cuanto a la profundidad. Yo hablo en mi experiencia siempre, para mí es algo sumamente revelador reconocer estas heridas profundas y la fachada.
Y Y esto me da pie perfectamente a contar algo que aún no hemos conversado de ello en una charla grabada, pero el otro día comenzamos un poco después de la primera grabación, la que hicimos con Ana Pilar y tú, de esta nueva serie, el tema de conversaciones con Dios. Esos libros, él te lo relata. O sea, este señor, que ya venía de ser ayudante de personas muy famosas de la espiritualidad, de Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, pues en un momento dado que se queda completamente en crisis económica, se enfada muchísimo, pero se enfada con Dios. Y entonces empieza a escribirle expresando mucha rabia, y acuérdate que Miller ha dicho, es que no os permitís expresar la rabia para con Dios. Y este señor recibió un regalo enorme, entre comillas regalo, porque es un regalo envenenado, que fue tal cual. Empieza a sentir esa rabia, empieza a escribir todo lo que tenía contra Dios, no sé qué, y en ese momento aprovechó un espíritu para meterse ahí, un espíritu que debía ser muy brillante, lo que sea, oyó el eco de una rabia que él también pues tiene que expresar para con Dios, a lo mejor algún resquicio, no sabemos en qué plano estará ese espíritu o grupo de espíritus, tienen que deshacer la última herida para con Dios, porque si no, no se harían pasar por Dios en ningún momento, porque ese espíritu se le presenta, no, yo valgo como vos que habla por Dios, yo soy Dios. Entonces imagínate, es un espíritu que no sabemos cómo oye el eco de una rabia dirigida contra Dios, y como ellos de la nueva era que llegan hasta el plano 6, son espíritus perfeccionados, como hemos visto 1000 veces, que nos cuenta Miller que están en el plano 6 muchos, millones que se creen Jesús, muchos de ellos. A millones, nos dice Miller literalmente. Entonces dicen, venga, allá que voy, pero por ley de la atracción. O sea que este señor nos está diciendo que en ese momento él empezó a sentir la rabia, pero algo en él dijo, no la voy a procesar, como un niño infantil totalmente, y en ese resquicio, ¡bumba!, se metió una canalización que ha vendido millones de copias. Ese señor se hizo millonario porque realmente contiene varias de las cosas, aunque sin la sustancia y sin la coherencia que vemos en la verdad divina, pero contiene muchos de los ingredientes en Conversaciones con Dios, que son una saga muy grande, que yo hice todos los audios, luego ya me los quitaron por copyright, pero ya los iba a borrar, así que me ahorraron un mogollón de trabajo de tener que borrarlos uno a uno, como tuve que borrar también los de Urantia y todo eso, que son realmente acciones horribles en este sentido cuando hemos conocido la verdad divina, ¿no? Pero fíjate que ese momento, o sea, cómo está todo lo podemos entender tan bien con esto. No sé si se me ha oído bien.
Sí. Sí, a mí me pasó, bueno, un poco esta convicción de que yo, por ejemplo, no la matemática, y a pesar de que calculo, mira como digo, intuyo en realidad que a causa del incesto que tuvo pues yo con mamá o mamá conmigo en realidad, es como que tuve ambos, tengo esa masculinidad de pronto dominante en algunas cuestiones y lo femenino no, pero sin embargo con la matemática tengo, y que heredé de mamá, una idea de reticencia. Así que para mí encontrar, por ejemplo, no solo esto ahora que me emociona y me traslada un montón de situaciones en las que encontrar, por ejemplo, esto que decías al principio, economía y función, encontrar en la creación los principios inyectados que le otorgan una coherencia, es que termina siendo tan obvio que ni siquiera hay que hacer un esfuerzo, simplemente, claro, la apertura, como dice él en este caso, y el deseo, que lo va a decir más adelante, más machacado, el deseo de poder sentir, poder recibir, observar, porque destituye todas nuestras teorías, las que con la arrogancia que tenemos negado a Dios, básicamente somos, sí, como lo contó con Amonia Mann, pequeños sí. Dioses.
Pero, y eso, fíjate, hasta qué punto llega el...
Claro, porque yo, ¿sabes qué me causó? Que anoté, Iván, la lógica de la ubicación de las hojas.
Sí.
Para que todas reciban la luz. eso me pareció algo que yo, la verdad, no, dejó algo tan amoroso, no sé, ¿viste? Ese detalle de cuidado, esa sensación de, no hay una idea de más o por algo.
¿Se está yendo la voz?
No, ahí solté, ahí acomodé nomás. Él decía un principio, no dijo la palabra principio de empaquetamiento, dijo la palabra empaquetamiento y no recuerdo.
¿Cuándo?
Cuando habló de las hojas, de que esa proporción eran la que llevaban las hojas de las plantas para poder recibir luz.
Sí, ahí es, o sea, por un lado tenemos lo de las piñas, que es como que están empaquetadas ahí al máximo de económica y funcionalmente las semillas, digamos, y en el caso de las hojas, claro, ya no lo llamarías empaquetamiento, ¿no? Que es a lo que te refieres,
Claro.
Sino que diríamos, pues eso, una distribución de las hojas. Y aquí tienes la distribución de las semillas. Que eso, pues, si se cuentan las espirales, pues eso. Yo tenía una foto muy bonita de un girasol por ahí. Pero bueno, que aquí lo malo es eso, en la Wikipedia no va a venir mucha cosa, pero no quiero poner mucho que no vaya a ser que salten los copyrights o lo que sea, pero la Wikipedia como no es copyright, sino que es para compartir.
Y la definición que en realidad aparece que es, bueno, cuando realmente valoras por igual tiempo, materia y energía, estás en armonía con los principios.
Estás, sí, en armonía.
En armonía, sí. Que es lo que rige, bueno, en realidad es como que hay una dualidad en los principios, ¿no? Que economía y función es como que trabajan juntos, por decir, que todo está en todo. Vida y desarrollo también, deseo y responsabilidad también. Y así. Pero siento que se ofrece al que desee, digamos, que se ofrece al que desee conocer, como que sí, está a disposición generosamente.
Sí, bueno, y es que de hecho es tremendo, porque, o sea, todo esto está castrado, por así decirlo, de la tradición, porque nuestra tradición cultural en realidad mundial contiene desde hace siglos esto. Y fíjate aquí en la Wikipedia, cuando se habla de la proporción áurea, pues empiezan a citar libros de hace 500 años, uno que se llama Proporción Divina. Aquí tenemos una ilustración de Leonardo, porque ¿qué pasa? Que estas distribuciones poligonales regulares, esto contiene la razón áurea por todas partes, los pentágonos, puedes hallarla en eso, en la construcción, bueno, y resulta que, claro, esas proporciones geométricas también están en el ADN, como vimos un poco ahí en lo que hice aquello muy simplemente por encima, cuando hablé un poco de la forma y de las cosas. Pero fíjate, estos manuscritos medievales, no sé qué, es tremendo. Aquí vamos a ver si viene alguna ilustración. Este, por ejemplo, es el libro que han citado. Fíjate. Aquí tenemos. Están haciendo referencias a eso. Mira, hasta con las letras. Bueno, vamos a ver si aparecen. Aquí están los patrones en la naturaleza. Y tienen un artículo dedicado solo al número de Fibonacci, que lo llaman, y a la naturaleza. Vamos a verlo. Bueno, es que este número phi tiene una riqueza brutal, es increíble. Y sin embargo, en la escuela, date cuenta que es todo, pues eso, el número pi.
Y tan...
Se llega al e para el tema de que también es bastante bonito, el tema de la relación que hay entre el número e, que también es irracional, de estos que se llaman así. Son los números irracionales, se llaman. Ya tienes tú, además en el nombre, lo tienes condenado.
Lo tiene condenado, sí, tal cual, irracionales, porque vienen de Dios. Ni el fundamento, no sé.
Aquí tenemos otro tipo de piña, por así llamarla. Bueno, vamos a... Aquí un estudio de hace un siglo sobre el crecimiento y la forma. El arreglo no sé a qué se refiere. Vamos a ver. Las simetrías. Aquí es que en general solo habla de patrones, no del tema de la naturaleza. Aquí tenemos el arreglo en 21 en azul y 13 espirales en otro color.
Bueno, hay un, no sé si la palabra es pedagogo, no es pedagogo, porque él estudió otra cosa, no sé si escuchaste hablar, Iván, ahora no me sale, André Stern, no sé cómo se pronuncia, es Stern. Yo nunca fui a la escuela, escribió un libro él.
Sí.
Y él justamente cuenta que por autodescubrimientos, digamos, esta iniciativa de que los padres habían decidido no enviarlo a la escuela, bueno, hay que reconocer también que es muy importante que el papá desarrolló la beta artística. Siento que por ese lado, porque en las escuelas, cuando analizás la carga horaria y la distribución, se visibiliza el paradigma de importancia, digamos, lo artístico está muy relegado en segundo plano, cualquiera de las actividades plásticas y también física, excepto que vayas a una escuela con un perfil definido en eso, no hay, digamos, son las menos. Y bueno, él directamente no fue, y eso promovió un desarrollo natural y espontáneo de sus intereses, fue respetado y aprendió solo en este sentido. Es maravilloso su proceso, porque no es que termina siendo un analfabestia, como se piensa la gente, que desde el miedo que tiene, el terror, no enviar a la escuela a un niño, pero como a través de sus propios intereses, explica bien en el video de deseo y responsabilidad, se puede absolutamente incluso estudiar, o sea, académicamente hablando, elegir una carrera, pero siempre ya amorosamente, sin nada impuesto, con la especificidad de las áreas y los espacios que te gustan. Él cuenta haber descubierto.
¿Cómo se llama? Para buscando Ter con dos.
André con tilde en la E, Stern. Habla de la ecología de la infancia, ese es su concepto, justamente ecología, teniendo en cuenta todo, digamos, natural.
Stern.
Stern, sí,
Pero es joven, ¿es francés o él?
Es francés. Bueno, tiene varios, él habla del jugar como eje de, digamos, en realidad él dice, no es un método, es la alternativa a todos los métodos. Él dice que cuando ya se habla de un método, ya está encasillado, digamos. No.
Que es constructor de guitarras, músico, periodista.
Sí,
autor.
Sí, varios. Sí, él recuerda, por ejemplo, al luthier que le enseñó y le dijo, yo no te voy a enseñar nada, yo te voy a mostrar lo que hago y vos vas a hacer lo tuyo. O sea, como que él recuerda eso, para él muy importante, la influencia de no voy a hacer yo el que te enseñe, sino que vos vas a mirar y vas a hacer
Sí.
tu versión de lo que... Bueno, y André, bueno, es creo que es neurocientífico, pero lo que iba con esto es a lo que llega, porque su cuaderno era ese, y decía él, mi nombre es André, yo nunca fui a la escuela cuando se presentaba y no como caramelos, porque él decía que la gente a los niños le quiere dar caramelo y él no entiende por qué. Era así, como que toma un caramelo y él no entendía eso y bueno, aclaraba cuando se presentaba, suele contar siempre. Y bueno, de él, por ejemplo, yo sentí mucha empatía con André cuando decía, porque realmente ahora que comprendo la fachada, algo que decía hace un rato en esta revelación, todavía siento en una conversación que tuvimos, vos y yo, cuando hablamos de que mi profesión podía ser una adicción y cómo sentí esa confrontación con lo que estaba escuchando, que para mí no parecía otra cosa, como Claudia maestra era como algo indisoluble, ¿no? Y después comencé a reconocer, claro, sí, y a dar cuenta en hoy que yo...
Ahora se ha cortado. Se ha cortado el sonido.
Yo te escucho.
Ah, que habías parado. Vale, no, este es la web de... No es de él, pero...
André.
No, este es otro. Ya es la que visitamos antes. Este es
Bien.
Jaime Buhigas, que es uno de esas charlas en YouTube sobre introductorias sobre geometría sagrada y cosas así, relativas también a la creación un poco, aunque no habla de Dios tan directamente, pero Buhigas es así como que gusta mucho. Bueno, yo de hecho estuve en una charla suya presencial de casualidad y realmente es muy eso, mucho carisma.
¿Es español?
Sí, es un arquitecto que luego se ha dedicado más bien a todo este tema, el Buhigas. Ya lo enlazaremos.
Bueno.
Y bueno, pues eso, podemos dejarlo para que no sea muy largo y no asustar, porque es un vídeo muy bonito, y luego pues a ver qué hacemos. Vale, pues nos despedimos de tu público amado, despídete.
Sí, muchas gracias. Disfruto mucho esto. Ojalá les guste.